Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to learn about getting the values inside of Redux into our components. So how do we do this? Well, there's actually another hook that we need in order to extract data out of Redux. And this is called the useSelector hook. So useSelector is a hook that allows us to interact from a component with the Redux store. What is a selector, though? So first, in order for us to make use of this useSelector, let's just get rid of what we currently have in context. useSelector is a hook that you pass a selector function. And a selector function is something that essentially extracts off the values that you want from the whole entire Redux store. So the state, as I mentioned, is one big object. The object, of course, is composed of all the smaller reducers, but in the end, it's really just an object that has these key values on them. So we actually receive inside of our selector function, whenever you call useSelector, the entire state object. So when you want specifically the user reducer, you're going to have to say state.user. And then from the user state, we're going to want further the current user property, like so. And then we just need to cast this to some variable, which I'm going to call current user. And now current user being referenced here will be this current user object inside of the Redux store. If we come back to our application, we now see we indeed have the current user being rendered. And of course, that selector will go into our Redux state. It will go, okay, I have this whole state object. I'm going to go and get the user reducer. And then inside the user reducer slice, I want the current user value, which is this object here. So if you refresh, what you'll see is that initially we saw the sign in and then we saw the sign out. So this is because that Redux updated. If I hit sign out now, notice that this still worked. And the reason why it works is because our selector updates whenever the state object changes. And here is exactly what we see. Set current user set the payload of null to this user value. Current user is being referenced using the useSelector hook right here. So whenever this state object changes by reference due to Redux, as I mentioned, every time whenever we update any of our reducer values, we always return a brand new state object with the changed values. When that happens, the selector will rerun current user updates and then React will re-render this component. So this is how you can now select values off of Redux and then put them into your components. So one thing to note is that a lot of these selectors are just functions that take state and then return you back the value that is deeply nested that you want. These might actually be reused though. We might want to reuse the current user selector. So what I want to do is I want to set up a file inside of our store called user.selector.js. And this will contain selection-based selectors. So I'm going to call it select to know that this is a selector function. And I'm going to say select current user is just the same function that we had. It selects off the state. It gets a state.user.current user. And now we just import this into our navigation component. Let's go up to our store folder, into our user selector. And now we can just pass this in where we had our originally hard-coded selector function. And now if we save this and we go back and we refresh, here we see that we are with an empty current user value. But if we sign in, there we go. We see that we're still pulling the correct value from our new reducer value. So this is selectors. We've pretty much now learned all of the basic bits and pieces of working with Redux. What I want you to do is I want you to think a little bit about all these parts that you've learned. Because a lot of this is more confusing due to all of the boilerplate that we had to set up. We created 4 different new files: actions, reducers, selectors, and types. And in order to utilize it inside of our React component, we had to build out a store object. We had to build out a root reducer. There's just a lot of moving pieces. So despite the fact there are so many pieces, it is something that will definitely come to you with practice. Because as you practice, you'll realize why each of these pieces are necessary. And what I want you to do is actually think about how we generated and set up these selectors. So now that we have all these bits and pieces, before you proceed, I really want you to make sure that you understand all of these moving parts that went into this Redux migration for just the user context. In the next video, we are going to reiterate on this and convert another context over to Redux. I'll see you in the next video.